Hey everybody, how's it going? Yeah. So welcome to our talk. We're going to talk about Toybox, which is the experience that we built to show off basically the Oculus Touch controllers.
I'm Matt Alderman. I'm the Touch software lead for Oculus.
And I'm Dillon, and I'm the social content lead. And we co-led the project to develop Toybox. So hopefully you got a chance to try Toybox. If not, I would encourage you to check it out. Like most VR experiences, it's difficult to capture in screenshots and video. But it's basically a multiplayer sandbox where you can play with a lot of different toys designed specifically for Oculus Touch. Just to give you a sense to frame the talk, we cut together a little bit of footage to give you a sense for what it's like. And so we'll run that quickly.
I think there's one more.
I got another click on it. There you go.
So Toybox was always kind of a goal for the design of the Oculus Touch while we were designing it. And to achieve that, we sort of had to hit a bunch of important notes while we were designing the controller. So I'll run through some of those now. One of the most important ones is what we call hand registration, or the fact that the touch controller basically lines up to your hand, no matter what your hand type or what the kind of grip on the controller is like, which allows you in VR to render the virtual hand matching the user's hand. We have what we call the hand trigger, which is the analog trigger resting under the user's middle finger. The important note for that is that it allows you to pick up an object and then use it. The primary example of that would be like the Rayguns in Toybox. We support gestures, so you can just naturally point at something in VR or give thumbs up or do the finger guns, and the controller will register that and allow you to do it in VR. We also have an array of traditional inputs on the controller. The traditional inputs allow you to take something, a familiar game design type, and sort of bring it into a new level of immersion in VR. The controller supports haptic feedback. The haptic feedback is driven by a linear actuator. It has lower latency and higher fidelity than your standard rumble controller. And in VR, this becomes extremely important because it actually allows you to provide a physical association with what is happening visually to your hand. And it sort of cements you in the world better. All of this kind of combined together to achieve the core goal of the Oculus Touch, which is what we refer to as hand presence, or the feeling that your hands are truly with you in virtual reality. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of the design of Toybox and its origins. Toybox and Touch grew up together in a way. It started out early on as just kind of a test bed for our hardware prototypes. So they had sort of a back and forth influence on each other. In the early days when we were designing these controllers, we didn't even really know what having a one-to-one touch or tracked controller would be like. There's been a lot of motion controllers on the market before, but the Touch was one of the first ones to actually provide the true one-to-one motion, meaning that if I move my hand 1 centimeter to the left, then my hand in VR will move exactly 1 centimeter to the left, which is really important for maintaining, again, the hand presence. Early on, the Toybox prototypes also showed us how important social aspects of virtual reality were. For instance, we created a sort of really simple mini golf game in virtual reality, and it was fun, but we thought, okay, we'll just throw some multiplayer into it and some really simple like box head avatars, and it ended up being hours and hours of time wasted at that point. So it was really apparent super early how great a social virtual reality experience is. As we approached E3, we kind of sat down and thought, okay, what are the things we really want to touch on, sort of punching this up and polishing it up and showing it to the public? And the first and foremost was just how important social VR is, how great it is, and how it really kind of changes the way you might have thought about virtual reality before. The second important aspect was just to demonstrate sort of the core features of the touch controller and how they let you accomplish great things. So when we talk about the design of Toybox, we have sort of two primary pillars. We have the intuitive aspect and the social aspect. And I'll kind of run through what it means for us when we talk about intuitive, and I'll let Brandon take over for the social aspect. So intuitive. At its core, basically, that means that when you're in VR with the touch controller, you forget that you're even using controllers, right? You're there, you're with your hands, and whatever you want to do just works. It should have an extremely fast learning curve. So once you understand sort of where the inputs are on the controller, they just sort of melt away into the background. And so if I see something and I want to pick it up, I reach out and I pick it up. And I'm not thinking, OK, that's this button over here and that button over there. Like, I just do it. Getting to that point of being an intuitive experience, we ran into a lot of design challenges that I think are kind of interesting. So I'll go over some of the high level on that. So when we started out, we implemented a hand, and we have your hand in the world with good hand registration, and we're showing it right where your hand is in real life. And we build a world around you. And the first thing that happens is you go and you put your hand through something in the world, and the hand in VR stops. And that immediately breaks your hand presence. So we kind of take a step back and go, OK, well, maybe we'll just let your hand pass through objects in the world. So that works. And now I have hand presence, and I'm sweeping my hands through the world, and that's great. And I go and I pick something up, do it again, and the thing gets knocked out of my hand. And it's not always intentional. There's just sort of this aspect of, in real life, if I'm holding something and I bump into a table with an object in my hand, like, I'll feel it starting to slip out of my grip, and I'll tighten my grip, and I'll maintain it. In virtual reality, because you don't have that hard haptics, like, there is no feedback telling you you're about to drop something. So we went with basically, when you're holding an object in your hand, that also passes through the static world. So that's working great. We've got the hand, we've got the things passing through the table. But we still have problems with things like, if I take my hand and I'm pushing on something, like if I have a cube sitting on the table and I push it down into the table, the physics engine doesn't really want to deal with that, right? It's trying to separate the two objects, and it's sort of like stretching a big rubber band. And I remove my hand, and the cube goes flying off into space. I'm like, oh, well, that's not good. So we spent a lot of time sort of tuning those responses to, you're really expecting sort of a sane response to an insane input. But basically, in the end, it kind of comes down to, like, do the least amount of work to get the physics back under control. Let's see. One of the other problems we ran into was sort of constrained interactions, like imagine a lever or a switch or a crank or something like that. And those are just really difficult, because if you have this lever pull, you only have one axis along which to move the lever. And if I do this, there's no real sane reaction to that unless you want the lever to break off. The easiest way we found to solve that was just doing basically limited overlap. So something like a switch works really well. A button press works really well. As you start getting into things like a virtual steering wheel, like, you start having more and more problems. And there's probably great solutions for them, but we haven't found them yet. The other one we had was we put a puppet into virtual reality. And so it was really fun. You could play, kind of sock puppet with this thing, or, do a little puppet show. But you would quickly grab it, kind of take both arms, stretch it, and the ragdoll would just break apart. And the way we worked around that was, in Toybox, we created the robot that actually disassembles. So when, again, the physics constraints are sort of breaking down, we just run with it and say, OK, we'll break the robot instead of breaking your expectations. OK. So the next thing we ran into was sort of this weird, unexpected physical responses with objects in the world. I've got a couple examples. Like, if you put a long stick into your hand and you're holding it, in real life, like, you have this thing where the stick kind of moves naturally. It may reorient in your hand, like your hand has a little give to it. And in virtual reality, if it's just rigidly mounted there, it has this really unrealistic motion. Like, it's uncannily steady. We had a frying pan at one point, and this one felt weightless. It feels like you're holding kind of a styrofoam frying pan. You just have this expectation of something constantly pulling down on your hand. The last example of an object that just didn't work well was like, if you've seen Toybox or in the video, we have like the Roman candles, and you're in a room where there's some walls that are destructible. And early on, we thought, okay, well, you can take those and kind of swing at the walls and break the bricks apart. But because, again, you don't have that hard haptic feedback, the world just ends up feeling sort of made of paper, and kind of, it's not an exciting feeling. It doesn't feel like being Godzilla or whatever you would want. So, in the beginning, the Toybox hand was actually physical all the time, meaning it always collided with dynamic objects in the scene. It caused a lot of problems with sort of interacting with simple objects. You can see our illustration where the character's just trying to set something down on the table, and usually that went something about like that, which is not what you're going for. So the problems, we broke it down and discovered that the problems were essentially people trying to pick up an object from the table will frequently overshoot the object. When you pick something up, you kind of move your hand at it, wait to feel the object, and then close your grip around it. But if you don't have that haptic feedback, you're going to overshoot the object and just sort of shove it out of your hand and then close your hand and miss it. You have the opposite problem when you go to set the object down. You'll overshoot a little bit, push the object sort of into the table. When I release my hand, the object kind of squirts away and it just doesn't work well, or it knocks over the chess pieces as you see in the diagram. My advice in those situations is basically tune for accomplishment. We kind of watched people using the early Toybox demos and said like, okay, what he or she was trying to do is just set the object down or just pick it up. So how do we make that happen even though the inputs didn't perfectly correspond to that action? So we stumbled on a couple things, which was we created the pass-through hand when you're not making a fist. And we tuned the grab volumes in the hand. So the grab volumes are basically like you imagine an invisible capsule on the inside of your hand, and we placed them sort of where your hand would typically make contact with an object that you were going to pick up first. So if you try this later and kind of reach out at something and pick it up, pay attention to like where you place your hand, and that's roughly where we found the best tuning spot was for grab volumes. Some of the things that I'd actually like to explore in the future that we haven't had time to do is how you pick up small objects or something that you would pinch, like a marble, where you would put the grab volume, what would feel most natural for that. And again, fingertip grabbing. So like if you're grabbing something off a tabletop, it's not always that I like put it in the palm of my hand and like squeeze. There's sort of this fingertip motion where I sweep the object into the palm of my hand. And I think that that's probably a pretty rich area for creating an even better experience with virtual hands. So we've got the hand working, and we've got picking up objects, and the next thing that happens is someone tries to throw it, and that also failed initially. So one of the things that we sort of stumbled on or thought about was that when you throw an object, you actually involve a lot of finger motion with it as well for kind of the final finesse in throwing it and imparting a little more force or a little more spin on the object. And with the touch controllers, you basically have your single analog input to release the object. So for Toybox, we just kind of cheated. We broke it down into 3 different things. Throwing an object that you can't feel the weight of in your hand, you kind of don't map the strength correctly. Meaning that if I'm holding a heavy ball, I would know how hard I need to move my arm to throw it and kind of predict the speed that I'm going to throw this thing. But when I'm only holding the touch controllers, like I don't feel that. So we reduced the whole world gravity across Toybox just a little bit to kind of give it a little extra oomph. We also have what we call just a boost velocity, which is basically like whatever we think you were moving when you threw the thing, we kick it up just a little bit, and that's kind of a tune to taste thing. The second problem we saw with throwing was that there's an input correlation that's kind of difficult for new users, meaning that I'm moving my arm and I'm releasing the trigger, and I think I'm throwing it here, but a lot of people would sort of stop their arm motion, then release the trigger, and the ball would fall out of their hand. So what we ended up doing was doing just a velocity averaging over like the last 10 to 20 frames, and that would give you a really nice sort of I don't know, safety net for people like that. So like you didn't have to have that trigger release spot on to get the ball to go how you would want. And the final thing we did was, in the original Toybox, basically at 50% of the trigger you were grabbing an object, and at 50% of the trigger you would release the object in the other direction. And what we actually discovered was that the first motion of the trigger being released generally corresponded best to when the person expected to throw the object. So the position in the trigger for grab is really early, and then when you're going and you're throwing the object, the first indication that the trigger is being released is when we actually release the object from your hand. So that's it for intuitive.
All right, cool. So I'm going to talk about how we made Toybox Social. So internally at Oculus, we've been building multiplayer VR prototypes for a while, and we knew just how uniquely compelling it was to feel the presence of another person in virtual world with you. Like Matt was speaking about the mini golf game, and I wish we could be playing that now, actually, maybe after the talk. But with Oculus Touch, like even the early experiences were just with the headset. But when you actually have these controllers that give you the sense of having your hands with you, it's not just great for like being able to intuitively interact with things, but also it's just super important part of in-person communication, right? Like we're very gestural with our hands. And so we wanted to make sure that that was front and center in Toybox. And so like, this obviously involves a lot of multiplayer engineering, but from a design perspective, the most important thing to get right was the avatar design. And there are a lot of design considerations that go into making social avatars work well that are pretty unique to VR. And so I want to talk through some of those. So first, voice is obviously a fundamental part of any form of social communication. Unfortunately, the Rift has this like really nice design feature in the form of a good microphone that's built right into the headset. And so like we get to actually network your voice and then spatialize it exactly where it would be in the VR space. And the spatialization is actually really important because otherwise, your voice communication with the person would sound like talking on a phone and then having them right next to your ear. But like being able to identify where somebody is by their voice alone, and then like having it actually represent their physical space makes them actually feel like they're in the virtual space with you in a really significant way. And I'll give you a word of warning if you get into implementing stuff like this. There are a lot of voice compression techniques out there, but most of these are tuned to kind of like preserve only the most important parts of the audio for speech comprehension, which is not necessarily what's best for sort of like accurate audio reconstruction. And that means that if you send a heavily compressed voice stream, it can sound like the person's voice is coming out of like a teleconferencing speaker attached to their mouth as opposed to actually like being there directly speaking to you. And so for Toybox, what we wound up doing was actually just sending the raw 48 kilohertz PCM audio and then spatializing it on the receiving end. That may not be appropriate if you're networking your VR experience over the internet and have like more stringent bandwidth requirements. But just be advised that like you can't really take an off-the-shelf like video conferencing audio compression scheme and use it. You're gonna have to dial the knobs very carefully and tune it to make sure that it's kind of like preserving that sense of the person actually being there with you. And the other, really important part of making a good VR avatar is to track the motion of the headset and the controllers. Like, as Matt was talking about, our tracking is really accurate and really high frequency. And the nice thing about that is that, obviously it's great for your own registration, but it really kind of captures the nuances of human motion. And you'd be surprised at just how much those like 3 transforms do to communicate the presence of the human. Like, all of our early experiments had like really simple representations of avatars with like, basic geometric primitives for your heads and your head and your hands. But like just with like the high quality tracking that we had, like you would see a box dancing in front of you and you would know that there was a person behind it. Send those transforms. This is also an instance where you might think that there's a lot of opportunity for optimization. You could potentially, you could quantize the transforms that you're sending across, or you maybe send them at a lower frequency and then like interpolate in between frames. But be careful here too, because you run the risk of losing the magic of the motion that makes the avatar believably human. You can quickly get to a point where like you cross this perceptual threshold where like the person no longer feels like a person, but feels like an animated character being driven by a remote person. And so, for Toybox, again, this is an instance where we just send sort of like the 90 hertz uncompressed transforms, which mirrors basically the quality of the tracking, which is very good. You might need to reduce it a little bit depending on your requirements, but again, be careful here because there's something about the noise of human motion that's really important for creating the sense of a person, and you don't want to lose that in the process. So, of course, outside of tracking, if you do a good job on that, you're still very much at risk of landing in the uncanny valley. I really like these little guys. And this problem is harder in VR than it is in other media. And I think the reason is because we're able to capture like pretty significant parts of social performance very accurately, but we can't others. So like we've got great head tracking, we've got great hand tracking, we've got high quality voice recording, but there's like a lot of stuff, like those are really, really important social signifiers for a social performance, but there's a lot of stuff that we don't have yet, right? So like we don't have your full body pose, we're not capturing what's going on with your facial muscles, we don't have the movement of your eyes. Though I would recommend, we have a SIGGRAPH paper that came out of our research group that where you can learn about some of the cool stuff that could potentially come down the road. But you might think that like even without that stuff, like maybe you can simulate it, right? So like maybe you could like use IK to construct a body pose for an avatar, or like do some artificial animation and that kind of stuff. But I'll warn you that it's very risky. Like with high quality tracking, you are going to already have the sense that your avatar is real, and then if you layer any kind of simulation on top of that that either like does something that the player doesn't expect, or that is sort of like over exaggerating a human behavior, it can push your avatar right into the uncanny valley. That won't necessarily break the sense of social presence, but it's kind of unsettling and it makes the social interaction really uncomfortable. And so one of the things that we've found is that it can help to actually simplify the signifiers that we can't track accurately from the design of the avatars. So for example, if you have an avatar with realistic eyes that don't move, you get this creepy dead stare. And like one of the things that you can do is just like not have eyes in the design of your avatar. So like for Toybox specifically, we designed like pretty human-shaped avatars, but then we simplified the design to abstract the face. So we put a visor over the eyes so that we didn't wind up with the dead stare problem. And like instead of trying to articulate a fully modeled mouth when we were trying to represent a person speaking, instead we have this kind of like music visualizer style mesh distortion thing that happens over the mouth area when they speak. And we found that those sort of like carried all of the signifiers that we could track really accurately, give you the sense for the person, and then allow people to kind of like fill in the rest of the details in their mind. And so, like, you have to get that right for head. You also have to get it right for hands. Building good hands, though, is actually in many ways a more challenging problem, because they have to not just work for you, like on the other end of a social interaction, but they have to work for yourself as well, right? Like you have to be able to look at your hands and be comfortable with them. And like because the touch controller is designed to give you a real sense of hand presence, like where you feel like you actually have your real hands and not just holding a track controller. You run into these challenges where your hands are exactly where you expect them to be, posed exactly how you expect them to be posed, but they can still not feel like your hands if the design is wrong, and that can be really unnerving. And so we went through actually a lot of iterations on this on Toybox, and so I'll step us through a few of those. So first, we started with like just solid avatar hands, which were really good in terms of like your accuracy, in terms of being able to pick up things up in the environment and that kind of stuff. But what it felt like was that your hand had been replaced by a mannequin part, and it was super creepy. Like it was very uncomfortable to be carrying around these like mannequin hands. And so like the first place that we went from there was actually to try and represent the hands with a particle system to make them feel less solid and less like you were sort of like carrying around this other object in place of your hand. But the problem with this design was that it was like too impermeable. Like you didn't have enough sense of its position in the world, and so it was difficult for people to accurately gauge distance and pick things up reliably. So we became unsuccessful at the thing that we were originally successful at. And so then we started exploring partially transparent designs. This is where we landed, but the original designs actually felt hollow, like looking through a glass bottle, which could be mildly unnerving because of things like, if you have your closed fist and you can see your fingertips through it, it just sort of like feels unsettling, like something's wrong with your hand. But we came up with this approach of actually rendering the hands out to the depth buffer first before rendering the transparent material, so that they still look transparent, but you couldn't see through to the occluded parts of your hand. And that created something that felt somewhat solid and somewhat permeable at the same time, and those wound up being more comfortable for a lot of people. There was another issue here, though, which is that like they worked great in motion, but when you actually held them steady in front of you, it felt dead for some reason. And what we think is going on there is that like if you actually hold your hand up and keep it still, like you have all these kind of micro movements, like these little twitches that kind of inform your brain that your hand is alive. And then our hand didn't have that, and we also so first thing we tried was to experimentally kind of like jiggle your fingers a little bit. That was super upsetting. Don't do that. That's really bad. Where we did wind up was to actually add a second layer of motion in the form of this like wireframe pattern that would periodically pulse over the surface of the hand. It didn't disrupt the silhouette, but it gave the hand a sense of aliveness that kind of made it more comfortable for people if they were very closely examining it. And like, you know, I'm not saying like these are all the design decisions you should make. You should have glowy blue hands with wireframes on them. But these are, you know, these are sort of like the process that we went through to arrive at something that was comfortable for a lot of people. And you have to take all of these things into very careful consideration when designing avatars. And you know, take it seriously because like the people are all different, and like the things that you're comfortable with when you're looking at a design for yourself aren't necessarily the same for other people. Like we see all of these instances of like, you know, some people don't mind being submerged in solid objects. Other people, it's very upsetting for them. And so like, get out in front of this early, test your stuff a lot, make sure that it's comfortable for a broad class of people. And also, if you want a cohesive avatar design, I'd recommend getting your hands right first because that's where you're going to spend the most time iterating on them and making them comfortable for both you and the other person. And then you can use that to inform the design of your heads. So, all right. So I also want to touch on. So that's sort of like our thoughts on avatar design. But you know, obviously another important social consideration for the design of toy boxes, like what it's like as an experience to interact with another person. And originally, like we thought it would be funny to theme the experience of playing with a bunch of neat toys in VR around like visiting your rich friend in the metaverse. And so like you started out in this like posh apartment that was like floating impossibly in space, and like your friend would be on the other side of the table, very chromed out table, where they would dole out toys for you and give it to them to play with and like show you how to use them and kind of like control the experience. But after we built it, we remembered that the experience of visiting your rich friend and having him show you all of their toys actually totally sucks. Because you just want to play with everything, and you don't want to have somebody mediating your experience with it, right? And so in some ways, I think this was actually a testament to the power of social interaction in VR. Like, if you get your avatars right, it doesn't feel like a multiplayer game that provides a social, like an abstraction of a social interaction. It just feels like hanging out with another person in real life. And so when you're thinking about how to design fun social experiences in VR, like, think about what makes for a fun social experience in real life, because when you build it, that's what it's going to feel like. So we ultimately revised the design of Toybox to be more abstract. So we would create these different spaces that served as good playgrounds for different kinds of toys. And we reframed the host from being someone who was slowly doling things out for you to play with into a person that was simply there to play with you. And that was much more fun for everyone, including the hosts, because there's a lot of performance anxiety to put the toys in front of people and have them have a good time. When people can just be left to their own devices to play, it's quite nice. And it also allowed us to break reality a little bit, right? So we could introduce environments like the underwater environment or the outer space environment where we mess with gravity and let you experience playing with toys in entirely new ways. We found that this captured kind of the real world fun of a room full of toys, and as well as the promise of VR of getting to play in impossible spaces. And then, of course, once we were actually starting to demo Toybox externally, we found that the freeform nature of the experience really helped the hosts make sure that people had a good time. So if someone got really interested in one aspect of the toys, right, the host could spend as much time as they wanted kind of playing with them and showing them neat tricks that they could do with the toys. If someone didn't really like a particular toy, or for example, some people were sort of disconcerted by being made tiny, there were always tons of options for new things to play with or new rooms to explore. And we discovered a lot of fun stuff over time too, having one person hold a slingshot and have the other person grab the basket, and then you pull it impossibly far back and then shoot super far distances. Or we found that ripping off the hands from the robot toy and handing them to tiny people so they can use them as boxing gloves was super entertaining. And it was a lot of fun for us because hosts afterwards could get together and trade stories about the emergent discoveries that they had and the tricks that they learned. And then also people develop their own hosting style, right? Some people are really enthusiastic collaborators. Other people are sort of mischievous. I won't tell you which of our executives have tried to light us on fire. A few go on with the full out Carney Barker approach, come on down, shoot the laser gun. I obviously am not that style. I'm not a good Carney Barker. But the thing that was cool is that everybody's personality, even though everybody's the same blue person, right, comes through really clearly in Toybox, and it's one of my favorite things about it. So, and then I'm gonna hand it back to Matt to talk about what we learned about the individual toy designs.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm going to cover some of the individual toys and sort of the progression that you go through when you do Toybox and our thoughts on that. One of the interesting things about Toybox and the order in which you're exposed to the toys is that the age group kind of matches your skill with the Oculus Touch controller. meaning that when you first get into the world, like we start you off with just the simplest possible interactions and let you sort of build on that. It also sort of provided an interesting narrative arc in the sense that as you get better at the controller or you get older, you get to play with better and better things, and in our case, more and more explosive and destructive things. So we'll move on to the first room, which has really simple objects just to sort of get you familiar with the toys. So we have the blocks, which are sort of, after you've seen Toybox for a while, you forget. Like, they're really simple, and you kind of expect to move on from them quickly. But when you get someone in there that's never seen it before, like, it just blows their mind. They're sitting there with these new blue hands, and they're staring at a cube, and they may do it for like 45 seconds. And you learn as a host, just like, I'm just going to let you sit there and kind of freak out for a bit, and then we'll move on. Like, it's... So yeah, after you're done freaking out, usually the next thing someone will do is throw the cube. And as Brandon said, you know, their personality comes through really well. So some people throw it at the gnome, some people kind of toss it off the table, and some people go straight for your face with the thing. It's a really neat, immediate personality demonstration, and you get that feeling like what you're in for the next 10 minutes with this person. The blocks are also really fun for sort of co-op stacking. There's a lot of sort of competitive, like, okay, I'm going to put this on here, and then it's your turn. And like these things that just come out through having these objects in the world is really great. When we were first designing it, we actually thought that there'd be a better chance for sort of creativity, like they would fill kind of a building block segment. And really the demo moves along at such a clip that you just don't have time to do that. So we have a ping pong paddle in the first room. This was actually one of the really early things that we sort of built when we were prototyping, and it was really surprising to us how natural it felt. So if you take the ping pong paddle and you take a ball and you set it on the paddle and you kind of do the balancing game, and it was just like, this is what it feels like in real life. I can't believe that that's actually in VR. The one that didn't work so well was actually trying to play ping pong with the paddles. And I think it's some interplay with just like how you can swing them faster or harder than you normally would in real life, and the physics just isn't quite built for all the minutia of a real ping pong game. So I think building a ping pong game in VR would be incredible, but don't expect to get that for free if you build a ping pong paddle. We have a tetherball in the first room, and this was actually one that we sort of threw in on a whim and then just became like irrationally satisfying. It will occupy minutes of time of just sort of batting it back and forth between people. It's a great player versus player experience, and I think probably our number one cause of broken controllers too. I think actually the first prototype I ever saw broken was with one of our executives playing with the tetherball. So it's a great audio win in the sense that it was fun to play with when it was just sort of silent, but as soon as we got that like hollow thunk of like a good tetherball, it made it feel like the real object, even though it's sort of got a imaginary green and white painting scheme on it. It's also a good way to sort of create messes and chain reactions, right? Someone will hit the tetherball, it'll knock over a gnome, the gnome knocks over another gnome, you make a huge mess, and it's just a lot of fun because no one has to clean it up. We have a robot in the first room. As I said before, the robot was sort of our workaround for the fact that you could grab a normal ragdoll and just stretch it to infinity. It's got a good social aspect to it too. Like a lot of people like to play sort of wishbone with the robot, and like I'll grab his hand, you grab his leg, and we see who ends up with the rest of the robot when we're done. It's also really fun for sort of doing a puppet show or kind of dancing them around on the table. I'm really excited for someone to just literally make a puppet show game in VR. I think that would be great. I wish that we had time to do reassembly with the robot, because I think that would have been a lot of fun, especially if you could sort of build a gross Franken robot out of like 3 disassembled robots. So someone please do that for me. So the next room, fun with explosions. We sort of mapped this to like early adolescence or mid-adolescence, depending on what you could get your hands on when you were growing up. It's really sort of about mischief and just destroying everything. So the room has a lighter, it has sparklers, Roman candles, and M80s. So I've got a video of that. The really interesting thing with the lighter is that we put a sort of physics lid on it, like like you would see on a lighter of that style. And it was one of those things that didn't take a lot of work, but really made the lighter fun to just sit and play with. Like you can just dangle it from your hand and kind of play with the lid with your other finger, and I don't know, it makes the whole world kind of feel more real when you have little minutia on objects to tinker with. When we created the lighter, we actually created sort of a bit of an almost over-engineered damage system in the sense that the lighter actually does like tick fire damage to objects that are in its range. And initially we were just like, you know, it was there, and the easiest way you would do it is you basically say the lighter, just when it's near a sparkler, it lights the sparkler, and that's that. But the damage system meant that we could make sparklers do slightly less damage, but they could still light another sparkler. Or the wick of an M80 can actually light a whole bunch of M80s if you stack the wicks carefully together. And it created a bunch of kind of emergent things that were really nice to have for not a lot of extra work. Interesting note on the lighter is that in the second room, we actually put 2 lighters because we were thinking, okay, well, you know, we didn't want the visiting your friend and getting things doled out anymore, so you each get a lighter. The problem was that when we were playtesting this early, like, someone would see the lighter, grab it, light everything in the room on fire, and then the fun would be over in about 10 seconds. So we actually didn't have time to fix this before we went to E3. And so we ended up just sort of social engineering the guests, in that you spawn into the room, and the first thing you do is you go, hey, you see that lighter over there? Yeah, it's right on your left. Can you just pick that up and hand it to me? And you grab their lighter away from them, and then you say, okay, now pick up 1 sparkler, and let's start doing some fireworks. I hope I didn't ruin the host's experience if any of you play Toybox later. Don't give them the lighter. One of the interesting things with the Roman candle is that the balls will actually shoot out and bounce off things in the world. They'll also bounce off the avatars' heads. And early on, there was no reaction when that happened. So it would hit the avatar, bounce off, and it made the avatars feel like they sort of weren't in the world. Like they were a part of it, but they weren't part of the physics and the interactions of the world. So we added like a graphical effect. So it's like this ripple that kind of goes through the head whenever it gets hit with something. And it just that little bit really made like you and the person you're with feel like a part of this world together. The second room also has our remote control tank. The tank is our example of the traditional inputs that are on the touch controller. It's sort of a gamer-centric toy, meaning that if you're not a gamer, it can sort of both be a little complicated and also just not very interesting. But I think it stands as an interesting example of how you could take a traditional game and kind of map it into an interesting virtual reality experience. The tank uses remote control car controls, meaning that like forward is always tank relative forward. And when we were designing it, we didn't even really think about it. We're just like, okay, we're building an RC tank. This is the way remote controls work. But people get into Toybox that don't have those expectations and actually expect sort of gamer controls, in that they want the tank to drive towards them if they pull the stick towards them in the world. And it was just sort of surprising to see that like different people actually have different levels of expecting real reactions versus like game logic. The tank has an interesting implementation. We knew we wanted something like that, but when we started looking at it, we were thinking, oh, we're gonna have to do like full vehicle physics. We're gonna actually have to like drive the wheels and make sure that all the friction is correct on everything. And one of the sort of last ditch things we tried just to see if it would work was we put sort of 2 force vectors right on the back of the tank that just push the thing forward based upon like the angle of your thumbstick. And that's actually how it is today. It worked great, and it was just sort of a lucky shortcut, because I don't know that it would have made it in if we had to go the full route with it. The other nice trick is that if you can get someone to take you to space with the tank, you can actually fly it around like a little jetpack, because it'll just propel itself off into space. So the other interesting thing with the tank in the second world is that we have a bunch of walls in the world that are all destructible. And it's, destructible walls are nothing new, but in VR, it's got this fun element of like, you can hide the tank behind something, but then the other person can sort of look over and see where you are and try to like shoot through the wall at you or shoot over the wall. And they were unexpected gameplay elements that I think really added a lot to that experience. So the final room is sort of our finale target practice room. It's more directed than the other rooms, and in some ways sort of a proof of your mastery over both Toybox and the controllers. The goals are laid out for you. You want to shoot the targets. You want to shoot at these things. Like, it's more obvious, I guess. One of the subtle things in this room is that, well, I don't know if it's subtle, but we move the avatar next to you. And you notice right away that they're over there, but I've heard people talk about the experience after, and then that was the moment where they realized, like, that person doesn't have to be in front of me. That person could be, you know, anywhere in the world. And it's the first time that's really driven home that, like, you're in a virtual world and you can sort of move people around however you want, and there are no rules to that. So what's in the third room? We have the Slingshot. The Slingshot was our answer to the problem of two-handed objects having to adhere to a bunch of really awkward constraints. Right, if you have just a rigid object and I'm holding it in both hands, there's all kinds of ways to sort of make it break down. With the Slingshot, it's great because you have I don't know what that's called. You have the sling and you have the other part. And in between it, you have just, you know, the rubber that will stretch any way you want. The challenge with that was actually getting the audio correct. We went through a lot of iterations where there was just sort of this, sorry, Tom, this screeching audio sound that played when you were stretching it. And we had to, like, you know, carefully tune it so that it was, like, always made some sort of sound, so it didn't sort of, like, become silent and not become a real object, but still, like, not play weird game audio. The Slingshot has sort of varying preferences in our audience. Like, some people are really, I guess, skill and challenge oriented, and they're like, yeah, I want to sit here and try to hit something with the Slingshot, and it can be kind of tricky. And other people just sort of reach directly for the laser guns that are in the third room, and they just want to break things, and the skill doesn't matter. The Slingshot has sort of magic ammo in the sense that when you pick it up and you grab the sling, it just automatically loads. And a lot of people have sort of bought into the fiction of the world and the way that everything else is kind of realistic. And they're looking around on the table for something to load the Slingshot with. And you have to sort of cue them and be like, no, just grab it and it's magic, it works. The Slingshot's actually one of my personal favorite toys. As we were going into E3, we had, you know, 10 machines that we all had to burn in and make sure they weren't going to break down. And so we played a lot of Toybox. And the one we settled on was sort of, you take the Slingshot, you take the boomerangs that are also in the third room, and you throw them into the air and then try to hit them with the Slingshot while they're coming back at you. So it takes a couple hours to actually get good at it, but we had the time. So yeah, as I said, there are laser guns or ray guns in the third room. Sort of for better or for worse, games today are really strongly tied to guns, and we knew we had to have some example of that because people are going to naturally reach for that when they're creating their own virtual reality content. The guns were also one of the things that led us down the path for designing the hand trigger on the touch controllers, because we're saying, okay, well, how are you going to make a, you know, popular gun game franchise in virtual reality and still be able to, like, you know, pick it up, shoot, drop it, do all the fun things that don't require sort of an unintuitive, like, hold to drop mechanic or something like that. The guns have an interesting kind of conflict with social presence. It can be really, really uncomfortable to have, like, a accurately modeled gun pointed at you in virtual reality. So we knew we didn't want to do that in Toybox, but our first iterations of the ray guns were actually too far in the toy gun realm. They're like these big kind of chunky plastic guns that just didn't feel exciting or powerful. So I'm really happy that we ended up on this kind of 50s ray gun that has like it has enough cannon behind it that it seems like a realistic sci-fi weapon without being terrifying. So the shrink ray is another one of my personal favorites. It's in the third room. There should be a video with that. There we go. So the fun thing with the shrink ray is that I think the voice work on it is awesome. When you're tiny, like, your voice comes out as this screechy little guy voice, and the person that is larger at that point has this, like, deep, booming, intimidating voice. As Brandon kind of alluded to, it's actually a really powerful moment for some people. Like, some people do not like that sort of immediate exchange or, like, change in the power dynamics. And they actually find being tormented by a giant robot sort of unnerving. Who knew? When you're tiny, your hands are actually still enabled. And that was sort of a happy accident. We were going sort of with the design principles that I covered earlier, and we thought, okay, you're tiny, so everything's going to look really heavy to you, and it'll just feel really weird to be able to pick this stuff up. But we ended up leaving it in because there was just so much great stuff. There was the, you know, using the robot hands as boxing gloves, and there's nothing cuter than a little tiny guy trying to hit you with the Slingshot, and it just kind of goes, pew, and misses. So I love the Slingshot as well.
All right, cool. So yeah, so I mean, we're kind of going through some of the things that are, the specific things that we learned about designing good experiences for touch when we built Toybox, but we also kind of want to touch on our bigger, more philosophical takeaways. And so mine is that VR is social, right? Like, VR is only isolating if you design it to be. It's an extremely compelling medium for social interaction. It's a social presence is a real and powerful phenomenon. Social interactions in VR are effectively real, right? Like they're perceptually on par with being in the same room as the person, even if you're on the other side of the world when you're actually connected to them. And like something that was surprising to me is that it's already better than talking on the phone or chatting over video, even though we're only using the stuff that we're able to track today, and it will only become more compelling as the hardware advances.
All right. So my takeaway is just to remember that like touch is enabling hand presence. It's not just a controller for VR. It's not just an input device. It can let you feel as if your hands are with you in VR, just as the headset can make you feel as if you are seeing and experiencing this new space. The Oculus Touch was designed from the ground up with that as a core goal. And for the social implications are also huge, right? People talk with their hands. So that trailer that we showed you at the beginning and all the little videos were actually shot as one giant take with Brandon and I playing. And because of the way we set up the software to capture it, we didn't have voice working between us. So everything was sort of this like pointing and gesturing and like thumbs up, like charades game to get the shots set up. And it worked, it came off. So I think that's a pretty compelling argument. The Oculus Touch controllers basically enable you a rich, natural interactivity with this world that can be shared with anyone at any distance. And at the end of the day, like, we pretty much just made a bunch of realistic things in VR. I'm most excited to see what all of you create, like new and unimaginable things that I don't even know what they will be. I can't wait. Thank you.
We got some time for Q&A. There's a mic at the upper corner over here. If you'll walk up there to ask your question, that way everybody else can hear you as well. It's hard to see up there.
So my question's on the multiplayer aspect. Have you experimented with more than 2 people? And one of the common things I see in like voice conferencing or even video conferencing is people talking over each other, and there's the constant like, oh, no, you go. No, okay, now I'll go. Like, do you guys see that happening more or less in VR because you get more the body language cues and things like that?
I mean, I think the body language cues help a lot, right? Like a lot of the weirdness. I mean, there are 2 challenges there, right? Like one is latency. Like that's one of the reasons why it's and like that will be present to the extent that you have latency in your system, right? But the body language does really help to communicate a lot about sort of like how the person is wanting to socially engage with you. And so I think it's definitely like I honestly really believe that like a social communication in VR is significantly more comfortable if you do the avatar design right and they're not creepy than sort of like traditional audio or video conferencing.
And does the experience kind of scale in the same way you expect like a real group of people to scale? Like beyond 5, it's it's kind of hard to talk to everybody and difficult, or like what have you found there?
There's actually an interesting problem with that where you can kind of start down this design road where you're like, okay, well, I'll just place the people conveniently for who I want to talk to and try to build out these large groups this way. But it kind of quickly breaks down as soon as someone interjects, and like, I look at you over here, and then on your screen, I'm like looking over there, and it just, so yeah, I think that you probably have a lot of those constraints. There are probably clever ways around them because you're sort of not physically constrained to building spaces that same way, but you probably need a different dynamic than just throwing 30 people into a circle and hoping.
Yeah, and the more people you have, the more chances are that in VR somebody's going to be kind of spastic and be like, "Let's go to space again." Like, so I mean, the social dynamics are definitely different inside of VR, and I'm sure that stuff will evolve over time. It's a pretty interesting area for experimentation, though.
Thanks.
Hey, I was wondering about more of the technical aspects. First, did you actually use the peer-to-peer networking stack that was mentioned with the social SDK? Or is this like a custom solution for the demo?
Well, so the Toybox at trade shows is designed to run on a local network. We have a pretty low latency setup, and we're actually just using, in this case, Toybox is built in Unreal 4, and we were using their built-in networking to take care of all of our stuff at the time. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So I was wondering, how did you solve the issue of where the physics simulation actually happens, and did you have issues with physics sync there?
Yeah, I mean, so physics simulation is a really tricky problem at internet latencies. We were lucky to kind of get away with having a simpler problem of having physical machines that were close together. So we took the simple approach of sort of having the physics take place on the server. But yeah, I mean, networked physics over the internet is sort of like is a difficult problem, right? And there's a lot of active research in that field to get that right. Unfortunately, we got to shortcut away from some of that.
I see. Thanks.
Yep.
Hey guys, great talk. One thing, everything I've seen from the touch demos that they've been showing so far is just floating hands as opposed to any arms and arms IK. Is that kind of on purpose, or is it just that we haven't got there yet, or what are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, to get back to kind of like when I was talking about the avatar stuff, about sort of like not representing the stuff, or like it being very difficult to represent the stuff that you can't track accurately, you run into issues where if you're like trying to IK arm poses and that kind of thing, where it's like, there are actually sort of an infinite number of solutions for like, where my arm can be for a given hand position. And so like, even if you simulate something that is realistic looking for yourself, it's probably wrong. If you do that, again, it's one of these things that like different people have different tolerances for it. But for some people, it's really unnerving for their body to be telling them that their arm is in one position and their arm is in another, and that their visual system is telling them that it's in another position. And so, like, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying it's really difficult, and like your brain is so good at filling in the rest of the details. Like you have so many subconscious systems that are available to detect human motion that like the stuff gets filled in people's imagination, and it's not a requirement to have a solid social experience with somebody.
And I think interestingly, like if even for filling it in for other people, if you weren't doing it for yourself, you're going to have to spend a lot of time recapturing that subtle motion for the IK system, as opposed to just being able to have like a static elbow and then these hands that are doing these really subtle like human behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Another question, the way that the finger and thumb are detected pointing, doing these gestures, is it because they're not touching the button, or is it by the moon controller, which is leading into, is there any plans or tech capability for the other three fingers?
I think that's a great question for Nate or Brendan.
Yeah.
Okay. I get it. And I was
Or
just
Palmer.
curious. Right. I was just curious, how long has Oculus and you guys been doing multiplayer prototyping before you started on Toybox?
I mean, we've been doing it for a long time. I mean, at least as long as I've been at the company, which was since the Facebook acquisition. So, I mean, obviously, social is one of these things that's actually really important for us to discover and explore. We always knew that it was our goal to like get a bunch of people connected in virtual reality. Toybox was like kind of an accumulation of a lot of parallel experiments that happened over the course of Oculus's lifetime.
Yeah, and honestly, like building VR games, we just sort of threw multiplayer in because it was going to be more fun anyway. So it was like, it's just
Cool,
natural.
thanks.
Hi there. The technical question two people before me actually asked basically everything I wanted to ask you. So the only question is, have you done any testing over the internet of the same experience, or you basically from the beginning said this will be local only for latency requirements?
I mean, I think we've done a little bit of internet testing, and it stands up. It definitely, like, as you introduce latency, like, especially for, like, the correlation between what your hand is doing and what's happening in the scene, like, it makes it, it definitely is a situation where it's like we prefer to demo it on a local network with low latency because it gives the best experience.
Definitely, yeah. We deal with some of the same problems, so that makes sense. Thanks.
Yep.
Why did you choose that specific scale for the shrink ray?
We didn't actually. When we first implemented it, I think it was like 10 times smaller. But we found that, like, one, that was really too small to interact with anything and sort of more disorienting because you didn't even really realize you were on the same table, right? You were just blocked by these giant polygons. The other thing is that there's sort of that sweet spot where you still have, like, the correct convergence to see depth information with your eyes, and that scale let us sort of put the toys right into that sort of 3D sweet zone for the person that's been shrunk down.
Okay. And also for the transition, it's an instantaneous transition. Was that because doing it smoothly induced some motion sickness, or was that for no particular reason?
It depends on how you're doing the shrinking. The method we use is we actually scale both your tracked head motion relative to the rendered IPD. And I've found that basically when you do this, if you smoothly slide the rendered IPD apart, like your brain doesn't know what's happening, right? That's not an input cue that you get in real life. And it won't necessarily make you sick, you just can't converge on this stuff until it's done moving. So it's effectively the same thing with a little bit of disorientation added to it.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Hi, really great talk. I love the attention to detail for immersion and for the social components. I'm Nicole Zaro from Zio Design, and I was curious about the social emotions and what the depth was that you're able to get at. We saw in the keynote the ability to start tracking, not for Toybox, but in the future, being able to track some of the emotions that come out of the eyes. When in the research that we do and consulting we do is we measure emotion on people's faces to get better player experiences. And I was curious, what kinds of emotions have you guys thought about in terms of social emotions? Because that's so important to why social interaction is so compelling.
Yeah.
I really like the story about your wife.
Oh,
video
yeah.
too.
So the video clips that we've been running here were all sort of like, it's Matt and I, and I just was curious. I showed it to my wife, and I said like, so can you tell which one's Matt and which one's me? And she's like, oh, that one is you. It looks like you. And I was like, no, the models are totally identical, right? Like there's no difference between them. And she thought about it for a second. I was like, well, what I meant was that it moves like you, and that I imprinted like you onto the avatar. And so like there's so much that is communicated like just with the parts of body language that we can gather today about emotional state and everything else. I'm certainly excited about sort of like the future and the possibilities for capturing more. But I definitely think that like especially with somebody that you're familiar with or something like that, where you can read them from a mile away, so to speak. Like that stuff already comes through really clearly.
So you can get identity, from the person's pose and from their motion. The seven dwarfs all in animation. They all move differently. Awesome. You can get arousal, excitedness. You could get negative and positive affect. But the social emotions like amusement and gratitude, Schadenfreude, some other things, you'll have voice, kind of communicating some of that. But I'm really interested in like what you might be able to do with that face.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to. I can't wait for when we're actually able to use that, use the face stuff.
Yeah, because when you do in the lab, you give someone a whiff of oxytocin, right? That's how you add that chemical to neurochemical. They will actually increase the amount of time that they gaze at your eyes. And so you're getting a dopamine hit, positive or negative social interaction, and then you're bonding with that person's, face.
That's cool.
And so there's some really interesting stuff. Looking forward to seeing what you guys might do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sorry, clearly can't get enough here. Can you talk more about the thresholding on the grab? Is that like kind of one-way trigger, or is that based on like the velocity of moving in and out?
So we're not doing any velocity detection on it. That could be a road that you could go down that would also work very well. This was basically just sort of a simple hysteresis. So it, the grab enables early and disables early.
So if they only kind of grab halfway, how do you let them let go? Is it?
It should be essentially a delta from wherever the trigger has sort of rested, right? So when you've completed your motion within some noise bound, then that's considered like grabbed, and then the initial movement will be released.
Gotcha. And is that something that is like built into any of the engines, or you're going to try to standardize, or is that stuff we should all be kind of playing with ourselves for the application specific?
Potentially yes to both, I think. Like I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I've found the ultimate solution for grab and release systems. I think hopefully, we announced some stuff today that like we'll be shipping some helpers for shipping good hand interactions and touch interactions, and hopefully that stuff should be in there as well.
Okay. Thanks.
Great talk. Thanks for that. Some people have big hands and some people have small hands. Is there anything related to that baked into the SDK?
Well, so the hands that we have in there, obviously, like we implemented them ourselves, right? Like, and I think the thing that we announced today, right, like, is about sort of like sharing those with developers so that they can look at our implementation for it. I don't know if that stuff is necessarily going to get plumbed through the SDK, but I will say to speak to that issue specifically, right? Like, that actually kind of goes into like making good avatar hands is about sort of like getting people comfortable. That's a problem we can't really solve at a trade show because like we're bringing a bunch of people through. We can't have a caliber calibration, that kind of thing. But if you want to make hands that are really comfortable for people, like it's probably a good idea to have some amount of scaling or customization that's available to people so that they can actually dial in something that feels really good to them to represent their hands.
Have you tried that in the Toybox demo yourselves?
There's actually an interesting sort of, I guess, anecdotally we've discovered that if the VR hands are larger than your physical hands, then you can map that okay. Like, I don't know if you sort of accept, like, my hands are inside of this thing, but as soon as they're smaller than your physical hands, it just feels weird.
Got it. No, thanks.
I think we have time for probably one more if there is.
If you can get it done in 20 seconds.
22, 21.
You guys are running out of time.
All right.
All right,
Thank you.